European travels, and paternal kin. Good morning, Mike. Hope I didn't call too early. I wanted to catch you before breakfast.
Not too early, Captain. I've been up for some time. Will you be having breakfast in the dining room?
Not this morning. That's why I called. I'm just having cereal and coffee here. Can we meet at the usual place about 10?
Sure, Captain. See you there.
Mike was relieved by the positive sound of his voice and arrived at their park bench ahead of the captain, but soon saw him approach down the yellow brick sidewalk, pushing his wheelchair at a good clip, using it like a walker.
Captain, you make good use of that chair.
Yeah, you should see me in Walmart with a shopping cart. I go through that place like shit through a goose. Listen, Mike, I've thought it through. First, it's a good thing that it was you to witness my flight and that no one else knows. I have been extremely fortunate to have a number of such providential events in my life. By the way, as you will see when we get to 1969, Providence in my life is a wonderful lady named Jean. That's all I'll say about her for now. Second, knowing now that I have actually achieved levitation certainly gives new meaning to dreams come true. However, I don't see that I can do much more about it except await my next flying dream and hope that I can progress toward a transition to consciousness without losing concentration. Your part is to keep an eye on me as we press on with this interview and hope it leads to something.
Sounds good to me, Captain. With Jean's help, I'm sure you shall succeed. Have you considered another try at returning to your childhood dream device of rolling your head back and forth on your pillow at night? It worked for you then to control your dreams. Perhaps it could work even better now that you know what is possible.
Good idea, Mike. I'll work on it. But my neck doesn't like that kind of exercise these days. I have a constant pain and restricted movement, I think caused when I relaxed too much on a carrier landing and my head snapped forward, aided by the weight of my helmet. Meanwhile, as I recall, we were going to talk about travels in Europe.
Right, Captain, the recorder is running.
In the summer of '50, I rode with my parents to Paris. Father was going to the Paris factory for a Selmer trumpet because they were hard to find. Paris was incredible, Mike. Unlike Venice, brochures or travel documentaries could not describe it. You simply had to go there to experience the unique atmosphere, culture, spirit, ambiance, lifestyle, or whatever it's called. For me, the most notable feature of Paris, especially after Georgia and Germany, were the gorgeous high-fashion women, fashion being braless, very low necklines, virtually down to the waist. It was a common sight to see couples kissing and hugging on street benches. Several times I saw those couples apparently meet for the first time. The scene was stark contrast to Munich, where women were typically stocky, without makeup, bundled up in drab tones of gray and brown, unshaved legs or underarms, and natural body odors in preference to perfume. The Selmer factory told Father they were making instruments for export only, so he set out to find a used one in a music shop. This occupied most of his time, leaving Mother and me on our own to tour the Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame Cathedral, museums, and art galleries. Of course, we were not spared Father's frustration and impatience with his unsuccessful trumpet search, so Mother and I retaliated as a team to make life even more difficult for him. Looking back on a photo he took of Mother and me sitting on the cement steps of a museum, pouting, Father had more of a sense of humor about it than I gave him credit for. Needless to say, since I had no time on my own, my Paris adventure was limited to day tours. Nevertheless, I was able to visit Harry's New York bar just long enough to join the International Barfly Association to get the manual, directory, and famous fly-on-a-bar lapel pin so prized by everyone at Munich High. At that time, there was an IBF bar in many major cities on the planet, but it was 20 years before I found another one, and that turned out to be an embarrassing event I'll tell about later.
I imagine the French were much friendlier to Americans following their liberation from the Nazis than they are now, Captain.
I'd say they were only less unfriendly, Mike. The French have always been so stuck on themselves they can barely stand each other. Nevertheless, Paris was the most memorable city I ever visited. Frenchmen had some justification for their superior attitude, though no excuse for their unpatriotic history, I'd say.
Where next, Captain?
My friend Pete Sell was born in China. His father was a Lutheran missionary there until the Jap invasion was imminent. Since he spoke all 26 dialects of the Chinese language, Pete's father received a direct officer commission into the Office of Naval Intelligence and served throughout the war. After the war, Pete went back to China on his own, working for the USO at the Yangtze River U.S. Navy patrol boat base until the Communist Revolution. When Pete found his white Russian girlfriend shot dead in the woods, he decided it was time to leave China to rejoin his parents and sister in Munich, where his father worked for the International Refugee Organization, which was engaged in resettling Iron Curtain refugees. My father firmly believed, however, that Pete's father was actually a spy. I don't know why Pete latched on to me, but he was very idealistic about friendship. We once went on a week-long camping trip in the Bavarian Alps, where, at Pete's initiative, after consuming copious quantities of high-altitude beverages, we sliced our forearms with a knife and mixed our blood in a blood brother Roman handshake ceremony and passed out. I still bear the scar. It was a bizarre experience for me, Mike, considering where I came from emotionally. I just went along with it, hoping I'd learn something about connecting with people. In the summer of '50, I was invited to ride with Pete and his family on a trip to Trieste and Venice. We overnighted in Vienna, where Pete's father attended a smoke-filled room meeting. The plan was to drive to Trieste through Yugoslavia, which was still a communist country under Tito, but had recently opened its borders slightly to tourism. When we reached the frontier in a desolate area, however, we found only a formidable guard post and barrier. It was obvious that no traffic had passed this post in many years, as there were weeds growing out of large cracks in the road. We were adamantly refused entrance on the pretext that we did not have a carnet for the car as a bond against selling it. So we drove to Trieste via Italy. At that time, the Free Territory of Trieste was an important seaport at the north end of the Adriatic Sea, which was a hot spot of political stress because of contention for it between Italy and Yugoslavia. We were there only 2 days, but Pete and I covered most of the city by foot. I remember Trieste mostly for the drive down the cliffs surrounding the port, and a toothless old lady in a doorway who propositioned us and was greatly insulted when we declined. Next were 3 fascinating days in Venice, a uniquely beautiful city that I can say no more about than you already know from travel documentaries. The first night there, we ordered chicken at a very posh Lido restaurant. Instead, they brought us a huge bowl of spaghetti. We didn't want to make a fuss by sending it back, so we stuffed ourselves. Then came the chicken. Spaghetti was the appetizer. On another night, we went out in the harbor on a gondola, where we joined many others lit up with lanterns for a concert by opera stars. Of course, St. Mark's Cathedral and Square was fascinating, but even more impressive to me was a museum collection of medieval armor, which seemed alive, and I felt strangely transported to those days. Jean offered a possible explanation in 1969. From Venice, we stopped in Cortina, a charming Italian Alp ski resort. As Pete and I walked down this quaint city's sidewalk, a most attractive woman, at least 10 years my senior, came toward us, so I smiled and said hello. As we passed, she raised her eyebrows, smiled broadly, and said hello very provocatively back to me over her shoulder. It was one of those "be careful what you wish for" events, Mike. I didn't have a clue what to do next, so I just quickened my step. Had she stopped, I probably would have run. On the long climb up the Alps from Cortina, the car overheated to the point we could hear engine oil sizzling like a frying pan, so we had to push it the rest of the way to the top of the Alps. Despite that, it was a wonderful trip. Now I want to comment further on my friendship with Pete. I'm at a crossroads choice about how much to tell in this story. There are things about me which may not serve good purpose to tell to people who would rather not know. Like the story about an evangelist revival, where the preacher was encouraging the sinners in his congregation to come forward for salvation through confession. "Tell it, brothers and sisters," says the preacher. "Come forward now and confess your sins to the Almighty, and all hear that you may be saved. Tell it now, brothers and sisters, tell it." So this man comes forward, falls on his knees, and cries, "Oh God, I am a miserable and unworthy sinner." "Yes, brother, tell it now, tell it," said the preacher. "Oh Lord, I had sex with my neighbor's wife," said the sinner. "Yes, brother, tell it, said the preacher. "And I had sex with my neighbor's teenage daughter," said the sinner. "Yes, brother, tell it. "And I had sex with my neighbor too," said the sinner. Yes, brother, tell it, said the preacher. "And then I had sex with my neighbor's dog," said the sinner. The preacher stopped and finally said, "Brother, I don't believe I would have told that."
I see your point, Captain. Why tell your readers things about you they would rather not know? On the other hand, leaving out the negatives is dishonestly one-sided, isn't it? I guess it comes down to how far you want to reach out to your readers. Perhaps your kids would be disappointed, but considering your history and family relations, why should that really matter to you now? So what was it, Captain? Tell it. Did you have sex with Pete's dog?
That's my boy. Chip off the old block, aren't you, Mike?
Just comes natural, doesn't it?
For you, maybe, but I had to work really hard at it. I came in second place in the 1984 Asshole of the Year vote because I was not a quintessential asshole like the winner. But we'll get to that another time. To answer the question, though, no, I didn't screw Pete's dog, but you might have thought I had as far as he was concerned. Our friendship jumped the track after our high school graduation train trip to board Hitler's yacht for the Rhine River cruise. One of the Pullman compartments was hosting a reception with lots of booze. Big deal, like we hadn't all had free access to alcohol all along. But this was a school-sponsored event, and the chaperone was Rex Gleason, our principal. We called Rex Rota Bean, which we understood was German for little red-headed fairy, entirely appropriate to his feminine and effete academic mannerisms. I believe Rex was disappointed that I had defeated his favored candidate in the vote for president of the student council, so he pursued the train-drinking caper to boot me out, though he had no direct evidence. He had popped into the train compartment after Pete and I left, so he could only assume that we had been there too. When questioned, Pete confessed, being the idealistic citizen he was. Then Rota Bean called me into interrogation with Pete present. I saw no gain for anyone in confessing, so I denied it, as Pete sat silent and stone-faced. So, Rota Bean could only take satisfaction in breaking up Pete's friendship with me, for it was a long time before Pete spoke to me again. Personally, I didn't give a damn. If that's what friendship was about, I was better off without it. So I just kept on keeping on.
How do you feel about it now?
I wouldn't be recalling it now unless there weren't some sadness. But these are things we need to forgive ourselves and others for. There's no good in bearing baggage, is there?
Not if the learning experience was beneficial. I take it the matter didn't resolve itself between you?
No, it didn't. Soon after, Pete went to work for Radio Free Europe in Munich. Then he left for Muhlenberg College in Pennsylvania, where he had been awarded a full scholarship by an anonymous sponsor. My father was right about Pete's father being a spy, though. He returned to a Navy admiral's uniform as a director of the Office of Naval Intelligence.
Did that surprise you, Captain?
Yes, it did, Mike, on two levels. First, that my father was so sure of it without knowing any more about Pete's father than what I told him. Second, that there was nothing about the Admiral's demeanor or appearance to cause me to think he was anything more than what he said he was, an ordinary, paunchy, rosy-cheeked, middle-aged Lutheran minister doing missionary work.
I guess he was good at spying and that's why he was an admiral?
True. One thing I enjoyed most about the Navy was the informality of plain folks dedicated to getting the job done with little regard for rank or regulations.
Surprisingly different from the perception most people have of a rigidly authoritarian Navy, isn't it?
Yes, Mike, probably because of the public images remaining from the brutal life in the days of sail. Aboard 18th century Continental Navy ships like old Ironsides. For example, weapons were locked up until battle was imminent in order to prevent mutinous murder of the officers by the crew. Thankfully, Navy life has improved considerably since then. But let's go back to travels.
Where next, Captain?
A few weeks after the Venice trip with Pete's family, I was on the road again with my parents, bound for Lisbon via northern France, Spain, and Portugal. From Lisbon, we flew to San Miguel Azores for a 3-week visit with my father's relatives. First, some family history. In the mid-19th century, my father's parents immigrated from San Miguel Azores to Fall River, Massachusetts, worked in the cotton mills, had 13 children, became naturalized American citizens, and returned to the Azores to retire in the small town of Britannia on San Miguel, one of 9 Azores islands. There they raised horses and cattle on beautiful property on the edge of an extinct volcano, Sete Cidades, and built their prominent home high in the center of town. Their retirement wasn't quite complete, however. My father, Manuel Benavides Sousa, was born May 28, 1904, the youngest of 14 children in the family. Father's middle name, Benavides, was also a family name. The very common names Manuel and Sousa, sometimes spelled Souza, are the equivalent of John and Smith in the U.S. There were 22 pages of Sousas in the Lisbon phone book in the 80s. Therefore, Benavides was the commonly used family name in the village. Since his siblings were either old enough to remain in the U.S. or died in childhood, and his father died of injuries from being thrown from his horse when father was 10, he was raised as a spoiled only child. Because father was the son of American citizens, he had dual American and Portuguese citizenship. To retain his U.S. citizenship, however, he had to come to the USA before his 18th birthday. Father said his future in the poor and backward Azores was hopeless, and he seemed destined to remain stuck in San Miguel to care for his widowed mother. As father told it, his restricted romantic life in the Azores was painful. Courting, he explained, consisted of Sunday afternoon visits to a young lady's home, talking to her from the front yard wall while she leaned out her front room window. Matters heated up considerably for father at age 16, however, when he jumped the fence for an affair with a married woman. He desperately needed to get out of town. Providentially, his bachelor brother Joe came to visit, and father sailed out aboard a merchant ship bound for Boston, supposedly for a short visit with his Fall River relatives to retain his U.S. citizenship. In Fall River, however, father soon felt his older brother Frank was being too interfering in his life. Then one night, father severely beat up a fag who propositioned him. Believing he had killed the man, father ran off to Portland, Maine, and joined the Army in 1924. Army still had horses, and father's intent was to be in the cavalry, but the Army thought differently. John Philip Sousa, the March King, was at the height of his popularity in the 20s, and Sunday afternoon military band concerts in the park were very popular family events. Wishing to enlarge the 5th Infantry Band for the popular evening retreat parades, the Fort Williams commanding officer held an inspection and reassigned the men with the longest hair to the band, where they marched, holding instruments without playing them. Father had played valve trombone in his village band for religious processions, but never wished to make a career in music. Nevertheless, with infinite wisdom, the CO assigned father to the band simply because his name was Sousa. Thereafter, father had virtually no contact with his Fall River family for nearly 20 years, at least partly out of guilt, but perhaps more because that's just the way he was.
Didn't that cause severe strain in Sousa family relations, Captain?
Not as far as I could tell. Everyone except father seemed able to forget it and move on. For years, Uncle Frank insisted that we come to Fall River for a visit, until we finally did in the 40s. They couldn't have been more welcoming. Frank was a dignified, respected, upright, and handsome man who was a well-known checker champion whose games were a regular newspaper feature. One of Frank's sons had only one arm, but was an Olympic world champion soccer player on the Brazil team in a year that their victory was so famous that there was a feature film about him. Another Fall River relative was Uncle Joe Pavo, who we visited at his beautiful home on Fisher's Island, New York. Joe was a handsome, dark-skinned, muscular, curly-haired, ladies' man of the sea, a confirmed bachelor, and lobster fisherman with his boat, which he took south to Florida in the winter for charter sword fishing. Had we not gone to Germany, I would have accepted his offer of a job on his boat for the next lobster season. Father's brother Joe remained in Britannia at the family home, with Mother Alexandra, married and raised two boys and a girl. The girl, Maria, and one of the boys emigrated to Brazil, then to Canada. Last I heard, that boy was in jail. The other boy, Joe, married a school teacher and remained in the family Britannia home until he died of cancer in his early 40s. Our visit in 1950 was treated by the entire island as a major front-page news event, because returning successful immigrants were regarded by everyone as wealthy heroes. Father was idolized everywhere and played the role well. Mother and I were overwhelmed and humbled with kindness, especially by Grandmother Alexandra, then in her 90s, severely bent by osteoporosis and less than 5 feet tall, but still walking 3 miles to church every morning. Every early morning, Alexandra awakened me with a bowl of hot coffee and milk. I understood that the coffee grounds were actually made from burned potato skins. Father taught me to say, "Thank you, my grandmother, very much." Wherever Mother went, someone held an umbrella over her head and had a chair for her when they stopped. Of course, everyone assumed Mother and I were Catholic, and there would have been upset feelings if the truth were known. So, Mother and I faked it for Father's sake and went to Mass regularly. Though we were so awkward with the rituals, it must have been obvious that this was our first experience in Catholicism. There was one minor miracle, however. I was walking with Father and his childhood friend one day, as they spoke only Portuguese. When Father's friend said something to me in Portuguese, instead of translating, Father said, "Ele fala nada," literal meaning, he says nothing. It was obvious from the man's expression that he understood that I was a mute, but that went over Father's head, so I remained silent, biding my time as they went on with their conversation. Finally, when there was a brief lull, I spoke. The man was so startled by the miracle that he became speechless.
Good one, Captain. But how did you get by with the language the rest of the time there?
There was a man in the village in his 30s who had been raised in the U.S. and spoke English. I don't recall his name, but bless his heart, he took time off from his work to translate for me the entire visit. While Father was with his friends and Mother was with Grandmother Alexandra, I was with the boys, who were mostly in their 20s. I had a hard time steering around answers to some of their questions about things like sexual promiscuity in Europe. I tried to be honest but vague in my short answers to conceal my own innocence. Things had changed in the Azores since Father's Day. The boys were probably more experienced with sex in the city than I was. One day I was introduced to a pretty girl, a bit younger than I, who was a friend of Joe's daughter and perhaps sister to one of the boys. Later, one of the boys put me on the spot by asking if I liked the girl. Well, Mike, I didn't know how to respond. I couldn't say no, I did not like her. That might be taken as rejection and injured feelings. On the other hand, if I said yes, I did like her, then that might mean we were engaged to be married.
How did you get through it?
I'm not sure. I just mumbled and smiled and hoped my translator would fix it up for me, which I believe he did, thank goodness. I did not see the girl again.
What was life like in San Miguel?
Simple, poor, and backward. The volcanic Azores Islands, named after their soaring birds, is 1,000 miles west offshore from Europe. Except for the U.S. Air Force Base at Terceira, the Azores was largely cut off and ignored by the mainland Portuguese government. I had the feeling that the clock had been turned back at least 200 years. Few roads were paved, few villages had electricity. Most homes were small, primitive stone cottages. The women wore black mourning shawls. Hospitals were crude. The government was oppressive, and few people were educated. Social life was largely centered around the Catholic Church and religious festivals. The people seemed to be waiting to die, a trait I noted in all Catholic rural populations, but more prominent with the Portuguese, who are said to be happy to be sad. Despite their poverty, however, people were very warm and friendly. At all the many homes we visited, we sampled their large variety of homemade wines and liquor, some very potent. By the end of the day, after making the rounds of visits, we were reeling. Father said that as a child, he always drank wine instead of water. Perhaps the wine was more sanitary than the water supply. An example of oppressive taxes was the requirement to have a license for cigarette lighters and a high tax on matches. Since there was a cigarette factory and virtually all men smoked, necessity mothered invention. Men lit their cigarettes by striking steel on flint into corn silk and blowing it into flame in their hands. The most revered and educated people in the villages were the priests. The Britannia priest I met was well respected for being social and down to earth. One told me, "The road to hell is paved with priests' heads." One day, however, I was presented to a group of 5 very young priests who were in agreement that Europe would be better off if the Nazis had won World War II.
Amazing to hear such an outrageous statement from young priests. To me, that implies approval of the Holocaust. Do you suppose they were taught that in seminary?
Possibly, but that view is not unique to Catholics. Many Europeans despised the Jews. For good reason. They feared Russia far more than the Nazis. But enough of that. Back to San Miguel. The Portuguese are known as men of the sea because so many are fishermen. But the fishing industry in the Azores was primitive. Since the islands are volcanic, the coast is steep, rocky, and open to the hostility of the Atlantic. There are few harbors. There was only one place near Britannia where small boats could be launched and recovered. Each morning, the fishermen manually maneuvered their 12-foot dinghies down a steep, narrow cliff trail to the water. 4 to 6 men rowed the boats out to sea and fished with hand lines over the side all day, and then hauled the boats and their catch back up the trail in the evening. The Azores was the last place on Earth where whales were hunted with rowed longboats and hand-thrown harpoons. While we were there, 2 14-meter sperm whales were brought in, so I went down to the factory to see them when they were hauled ashore. I had my picture taken next to one holding a large bamboo fishing pole. I have never smelled anything else nearly as strongly offensive.
Are they still whaling that way, Captain? Didn't the Save the Whale folks object?
Because it was such a dangerous profession, and so few whales were killed, Azores whaling was not on anyone's Save the Whales hit list. Nevertheless, typical of Portuguese ways, whaling went by the boards because the government failed to renew their license. My guess is that the oversight occurred because the fishermen could not pay the required bribe. As in many third world countries, government workers in the Azores were not paid living wages, and it was understood that tips were the common form of subsidy. Today, all that remains of the Azores whaling industry is a museum in Fayal.
No doubt not missed by the men who risked their lives going down to the sea in longboats after them. You mentioned volcanoes. Are any still active?
Yes, but on a relatively small scale. In the early 50s, one erupted on Fayal, which evacuated the island for a short time. The result was a modest expansion of the shoreline. There is a region on San Miguel Island where the ground is so warm that the vegetation is tropical and the ponds and streams are quite hot. The locals bake some meals by burying them underground. However, there have been no active eruptions there in modern history.
Sounds like a catastrophe waiting to happen.
Perhaps, but less certain than the floods, fires, mudslides, and earthquakes of California. And there has been no mass exodus of the West Coast.
Is there anything more you'd like to say about that Azores visit?
Just that the greatest benefit to me was meeting my grandmother Alexandra. What a magnificently outstanding lady. She was strong, intelligent, kind, and loving, even in her 90s. On the other hand, the most inexplicable aspect of the visit was Father's benign disregard for her. It was a long time later before I came to understand the Portuguese psyche, which also gave me insight into myself. But we'll get to that, Mike. There's a lot of Portuguese in you too. So let's end this chapter here.
Okay, Captain, as you wish. May I join you for dinner?
Of course, I'll meet you there.